Now, I've really been looking forward to discussing the Iowa class, not only because of its significance to history, but, its longevity of how long a service this battleship managed to last as opposed to all of its peers. And not only that, it's had numerous media appearances from movies like Under Siege, which, while was supposed to take place on the USS Missouri, was actually filmed on the USS Alabama instead, due to the fact that the Missouri was still an active ship at the time. However, the 2012 movie Battleship, which also takes place on the battleship Missouri, and whether you love or hate the movie, there is something to be said about the shots they did of the Missouri and, bringing it back to life and bringing it, and don't worry, I have my own issues with some of the historical inaccuracies in it, but there's just something cool about watching it fire against an alien ship. I'm sorry, that was just cool. So let's go ahead and get into the legacy, the history of the Iowa class, and how the United States got to where it was with that ship. So looking at this chart of the other main battleships at the time across different nations, the Iowa was longer than the Yamato. However, as I discussed last time, the Yamato is the largest battleship in terms of gross tonnage. It was nowhere near the size of an Iowa class, even though the Iowa was larger in terms of length. Now, as we talked about, just with other nations, the progression, the development of what would become the Iowa was just like every other nation, when we had a gradual process that occurred during the 19-teens. However, the United States kind of went about it a different way. After the New York-class battleships, including my personal favorite, the absolutely beautiful USS Texas, they actually developed what was known as the Standard Type Battleship Program. And this was a series of ships, starting with the Nevada class and going all the way to the Colorado class. And basically, each progressive series of ships was an improvement upon the problems discovered in the last series. So they would build a series of ships, usually 2 to 3, and then they would build the next one as an improvement of the last one, and the next one as an improvement of the last one, and so on. And this is why so many of those battleships of that time period look alike. And the final series, what was known as the Standard Type Battleship, was the South Dakota class 1920 edition. And had this ship been built, it would have been the most powerful American battleship at the time. More turrets, heavier caliber guns, even faster than anything the United States had built. However, of course, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 rolls around once again, and it decimates any chance of the United States building this Navy. And because the United States was the founder of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, they had to be a beaming example of the time. And so the South Dakota class had to be canceled. It just had to happen. Now, this treaty actually could have put the United States behind even further than the rest of the world's naval powers. However, Charles Evan Hughes, the Secretary of State at the time, and the General Board of the Navy came to an agreement. And basically the agreement was the older battleships could be sacrificed. They could do what they needed to pass the treaty, including the cancellation of things like the South Dakota class, in exchange for funding to continue developing future ships and the upgrading of the existing battleship fleet. And this is why we see the New York class, which includes the USS Texas, my favorite battleship, all the way to the Nevada and later on all the way to the Colorado, all receive a modernization in the 1920s. As they can't build a new navy, they can't improve the existing fleet and use this information to build a future fleet. And the moment the treaty stipulations end, the North Carolina class begins production. And this ship is based on everything that they have learned during this time of peace. And we get 2 ships out of the deal, the North Carolina and the Washington. These 2 ships provide a stopgap, basically for development for even larger ships, and that's where we get into the South Dakota class. Now, these 4 battleships are a great measure of upgrading firepower at a sacrifice of only a little bit of speed. They had higher velocity cannons that could do more damage, and while they were still 16-inch guns, they were better 16-inch guns. And like the North Carolina, we still have examples of these. We have the USS Alabama and the USS Massachusetts as the remaining examples of the South Dakota class. So now we get to the main point of this, the Iowa-class battleship. Now, this class of battleship was actually designed specifically for one threat and one threat only, and that was the Japanese. And at this time, we really didn't even know about the existence of the Yamato class. It was basically based around a hypothetical, theoretical idea called War Plan Orange, which was how the United States would handle a Japanese naval threat, because at the time, that was our biggest threat, was Japan. And they had the most heavy cruisers and battle cruisers and battleships. So we needed a ship that could handle that. So the Iowa was designed in mind to take on these threats. That's why it was faster than any other American battleship and more heavily armed, as it was designed to basically combat any major threat the Japanese could throw at the United States. So when the plan had been approved to build these ships, they actually had plans to build 6 of them: the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, the Illinois, and the Kentucky. Now, the first 4 of these would actually see service and action during World War II. And what we have here is actually a picture of all 4 of those ships together. And it's like the only photo of all 4 of them sailing together at one time. Now, the Illinois and the Kentucky never made it anywhere close to being completed. The Illinois was about a quarter completed when they decided to scrap it, and the Kentucky was actually moved out of dock, even though the main part of its hull had actually been finished, in order to make room for construction of LSTs. However, there was a proposal to do something with that hulk of the Kentucky. The idea had been to take this existing part of the Kentucky and basically turn it into a light aircraft carrier. There was some talk of doing it to the Illinois, but it wasn't far enough along for them to build it. They ended up abandoning the plan and going back to finishing the Kentucky, and then they ended up abandoning that plan and never finished the Kentucky. Now, just like the Bismarck and the Yamato had their own upgraded class, a future version, the Iowa had their own as well. This was called the Montana class. And while it would have been a little bit slower than the Iowa class, it actually would have had better guns, better armor, and a superior all-around anti-aircraft package, making it a much better ship. However, the United States abandoned it in favor of aircraft carrier development instead. And that honestly could have been the end of the Iowa class, like the Vanguard, Bismarck, and Yamato. However, it kept going. After the war, the USS Kentucky continued to be floated around the idea of what to do with the ship. There are multiple projects, including a anti-aircraft ship, a guided missile battleship, things like that. None of this really went, and they ended up just abandoning the ship and scrapping its hulk. Now, the guided missile version of the Kentucky, the BBG, was actually looked into as a feasibility study to continue the remaining Iowa classes that were already finished. And basically, it was just going to cost too much to convert the 4 ships into these guided missile destroyers. Another proposed idea for the Iowa class would have removed the rear turret and created a long deck for it for, short takeoff and landing, helicopter support, things like that. Basically turning it into a mixed aircraft carrier battleship hybrid. While the Iowas did serve in Korea and Vietnam, overall they remained the same ships until their 1980s refits. It is during this refit that we see this massive update to the Iowa class. They get better radars, they get anti-ship missiles, they get Tomahawk cruise missiles, they get phalanx gun systems to protect themselves, so the ship gets an all-around upgrade to itself, which really extends their lifespan until the early 90s. And by this time we begin to see them become museum ships by the late 90s. The Missouri and the Iowa were the first 2 to become battleship museums. However, the Wisconsin and the New Jersey were actually kept in mothball until 2006 because of the National Defense Authorization Act of 1996, which required 2 battleships to be kept in reserve. And in 2006, they were removed as there was no longer a need for them. And so right now, all 4 existing Iowa classes are museum ships around the United States. And we have no battleships anymore. Really, we don't. We're done with battleships. I would love to see the battleship come back. Feasibly, it's just not going to happen. I know they're cool, the big guns and everything like that, and thus we just don't have battleships anymore unless they're a museum. And I know there's that argument, why don't we have battleships? And, there's various opinions, money, finance, things like that. But the reality is the need for the battleship ended when the aircraft showed its superiority. And until there is a need to bring back the large caliber gunship, there just won't be battleships anymore on the battlefield. And that's sad to say, but the only thing they're good for right now is museums. And that's it for today, guys. That's the end of battleships. I'm done with battleships. Please look forward to some of my future series. We're going to do aircrafts that could have been. I will be doing aircraft carriers in the future. I'm going to be doing an interview with my brother who served in the Marine Corps as a tank mechanic, and we'll look at the Abrams tanks and the Marines losing them. So that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you all the next time.